Before we get into the resistance, let's talk about the role of the Israelis. They were very important, as I highlighted in the introduction, in consolidating the power of Rios Montt, a brutal dictatorship, but also in terms of directing many of the tactics that were used to crush, especially urban resistance. Can you talk about that?
Yes, President Carter had, as you mentioned, gotten a law passed with the great work of Senator Leahy that we could not give military aid to any government that was systematically violating human rights. Well, Guatemala at that point was known as the worst human rights violator in the Western Hemisphere. So Carter had the decency to cut off military aid. As I found out later, there were all kinds of ways for military aid to still keep coming in directly from the U.S., and which did, under the guise of professionalizing and educating the forces there or assisting humanitarian projects, but most directly through the CIA. They didn't have to say who they gave it to or what. And we had a system of paid informants, spies that were in military intelligence. We paid them. They tortured people and got the information and gave it to us. Torture by proxy. We were marriage made in heaven. But they still wanted to get back a lot more money than they were getting for arms and tanks and everything else. They were starting to fall into hard times. And at that point, the United States government, without Carter's approval, I hope, went to Israel and got them to send the weapons, the rifles, the Aravas, some of the tanks, I believe, that went directly to Guatemala to take care of the military. And that, when I was there, the national weapon for the army was the Galil. And as the daughter of a Holocaust escapee, my dad got out of Holland just in time before the Nazis showed up when he was 11. It gives me real pain to hear that the national rifle, the Galil, how great that is. It's like, what shame. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The most horrible thing, though, that they did, the Israelis, doubtless on request of the CIA and the U.S. government, because that's how our relationship works. That's also how our relationship with Guatemala works in other things. But what they also did was they arrived in Guatemala and set up an intelligence system that annihilated the urban underground and was very important in carrying on death squad activities for the next many decades everywhere. One of the most important things was to develop the computer system used by G2, or the intelligence division, so that everybody was in the computer with all kinds of notations and everything else. And that's in the National Palace, or was in the tower there. I don't know where it is nowadays. But they also brought these really frightening techniques for keeping track of everybody in the city and other places so that they could be grabbed, tortured, and then other places would go down. There were many safe houses, for example, in the capital city, where different groups of the guerrilla movement were hiding out and doing what they could. And at that point, the intelligence division learned from the Israelis how they could monitor the electricity and water supply in every single house. And if it was a house that was probably meant or designed for a family of 5 and was using enough water and electricity for a family of 20, they would go in there and massacre everyone in there. They got a little bit more adept later on and would drag out 1 or 2 survivors and torture them to get to the other houses. So, of course, the urban underground got extremely closed, but even then it was nearly impossible, even with the high security measures that they took to escape the annihilation by the G2. Another thing that the army did, thanks to Mossad assistance, was they would monitor all of the phone calls. So if telephone A called telephone B, it might be a 2-second thing where they would say, oh, sorry, wrong number. But if the computer showed that within 10 minutes, telephone C would call telephone D, and those would be public phones, not houses, then those two would have a lengthy talk. So very shortly, they'd have that area surrounded. And if A made another call to B and said, sorry, it's the wrong number, they would grab everybody at the C and D telephones and torture them. And of course, they learned very early on to take people's children. And they'll break really fast and give you more information. I know one witness in one of my cases had already lost his father, his mother, his wife, his sister, and his younger sibling to being disappeared by the military in a sweep. He had 2 children left, although not his wife. And when he was caught and severely tortured, he didn't talk for quite a while. But then they knocked down a church wall and dragged out his in-laws with the 2 children and brought them back to the base where he was being tortured and said, okay, now we're tying the 2-year-old to the back of a truck, talk, or we're going to drag him to death. So he talked. He said where a clinic was, and they came back and said, wow, we wiped everybody out in the clinic. You're the most important prisoner we've ever had.